The September afternoon lay golden over Gossington Hall, where Lady Bantry's annual garden fete had achieved that peculiar perfection of English village life, all cucumber sandwiches and gentle competition, with just enough underlying tension to keep conversations interesting. The lawns stretched immaculate beneath ancient oaks, dotted with white marquees and clusters of villagers who had known each other's business for decades, yet still found fresh material for speculation. Miss Jane Marple sat peacefully in the shade of the rose arbor, her knitting needles clicking in steady rhythm as she observed the familiar choreography of street Mary Mead society. Colonel Bantry held forth near the prize vegetable display, his voice carrying across the grounds as he debated the merits of different fertilizers with Dr. Haydock. Mrs. Price Ridley, formidable in purple silk, supervised the white elephant stall with the efficiency of a general deploying troops. Young Griselda Clement laughed too brightly at something the new curate had said, while her husband watched from beside the coconut, shy with the expression of a man calculating distances. The vicar's wife fluttered between the tea tent and the cake stall, her anxiety about the afternoon's success written plainly across her pleasant features. Miss Marple noted how she paused to adjust the same tablecloth 3 times, and how her glance kept drifting toward the gate, as if expecting either salvation or catastrophe to arrive at any moment. Such small observations were the fabric of village life, each thread revealing something about the weaver. Lady Bantry herself moved through the crowd with practiced grace, her silk dress catching the afternoon light as she dispensed compliments and gentle corrections with equal measure. She had spent 30 years perfecting these occasions, and her garden parties were acknowledged throughout the county as models of their kind. Every detail had been considered, from the positioning of the fortune-teller's tent to the careful arrangement of the flower displays that would be judged at 4 o'clock precisely. It was perhaps 20 minutes past 3 when Mary, the under-housemaid, emerged from behind the prize-winning delphinium border with her face the color of chalk, and her hands pressed to her mouth as if to hold back words too terrible to speak. She stood frozen for a moment, her usual composure shattered, before finding her voice in a cry that cut through the gentle afternoon air like a blade through silk. "Oh, my lady! Oh, please come quickly!" The effect was instantaneous. Conversations halted mid-sentence, teacups paused halfway to lips, and every head turned toward the disturbance. Lady Bantry, her hostess instincts overriding her alarm, moved swiftly across the lawn with Colonel Bantry close behind. Dr. Haydock followed, his medical training evident in his purposeful stride. Miss Marple set down her knitting with deliberate care and rose to follow at a more measured pace, her sharp eyes already cataloguing the reactions around her. Mrs. Price Ridley's face showed a mixture of horror and unmistakable excitement. The curate had gone quite pale, while Griselda Clement gripped her husband's arm with white knuckles. Such responses told their own story to those who knew how to read them. Behind the delphinium border, arranged with almost ceremonial precision among the prize-winning blooms, lay the body of a young woman. She appeared to be perhaps 25, with dark hair and a face that would have been considered quite lovely in life. Her blue summer dress was neat and unremarkable, the sort worn by a respectable girl from a good family. Most peculiar of all, she had been positioned with obvious care, her hands folded peacefully, and her head resting on what appeared to be a small, embroidered cushion. "Good heavens," Lady Bantry whispered, her usual composure deserting her entirely. "Who on earth is she?" Miss Marple studied the scene with quiet attention, noting details that others might miss in their shock, the absence of any disturbance in the surrounding flower bed, the careful arrangement that spoke of deliberation rather than haste, and most intriguingly, the small spray of white roses placed precisely beside the unknown woman's right hand. Dr. Haydock knelt beside the body with practiced efficiency, his medical training evident in every careful movement. After a thorough but discreet examination, he rose and addressed the small gathering in low, measured tones. "She has been dead for several hours," he announced quietly. "Since sometime during the night or early morning, I should estimate." There are no obvious signs of violence or struggle. Colonel Bantry immediately assumed command with military precision, his voice cutting through the shocked murmurs. "Arthur!" He called to the butler, who had appeared silently behind the crowd. "Telephone Inspector Slack at Much Benham at once, and see that no one leaves the grounds until the police have taken names and addresses." His hands trembled slightly as he reached for his pipe, a nervous habit Miss Marple had observed during previous village crises. Lady Bantry recovered her composure with admirable speed, though the slight tightness around her eyes betrayed her genuine distress. "Mrs. Price Ridley, perhaps you would be so kind as to escort our guests to the drawing-room for tea. Under the circumstances, I think we must suspend the festivities." Her voice remained steady, but Miss Marple noted how she avoided looking directly at the peaceful figure among her prized delphiniums. The assembled villagers reacted with the mixture of horror and fascination that accompanies unexpected tragedy. Young Griselda Clement had grown quite pale and clung to her husband's arm, while the curate stood frozen, apparently torn between pastoral duty and personal shock. Mrs. Price Ridley, ever practical, began organizing the retreat to the house with military efficiency, though her eyes kept darting back toward the flower border with unmistakable curiosity. Miss Marple remained quietly observant, positioning herself where she could watch both the scene and the reactions of those around her. This was a skill she had perfected over many years, the ability to notice without being noticed, to gather information while appearing merely to knit or arrange flowers. People revealed so much when they believed themselves unobserved by harmless elderly ladies. Inspector Slack arrived within the hour, his motorcar announcing his presence with authoritative efficiency. He was a man of modern methods, impatient with village speculation and dismissive of amateur theories. His sharp eyes took in the scene with clinical detachment as he exchanged brief words with Dr. Haydock, confirming the medical assessment. "Well then, Lady Bantry," Inspector Slack stated briskly, "who is she?" "I haven't the faintest idea, Inspector," Lady Bantry replied, wringing her hands. "I've never seen her before in my life. She's certainly not from Street. Mary Mead." A murmur of agreement rippled through the remaining onlookers. The young woman's face, though pleasant, bore no resemblance to anyone in their immediate circle. Miss Marple studied the scene with particular attention to details others might overlook. The embroidered cushion beneath the victim's head caught her interest, a delicate piece with forget-me-nots worked in pale blue silk. The stitching was remarkably even, except for one corner, where the pattern faltered slightly, leaving a tiny diamond askew. Such counting errors were common with the patterns sold at the church bazaar, particularly Mrs. Hartnell's supposedly foolproof design. The white roses arranged beside the body were equally intriguing. They were fresh, clearly cut that morning, but their stems stood unnaturally straight. Miss Marple's keen eyes detected the thin wires that held them rigid, the sort of preparation used by florists for formal arrangements rather than garden cutting. These were not Lady Bantry's nodding variety, but something altogether more deliberate. "Such careful placement," Miss Marple murmured to herself, noting how the entire scene possessed an almost ceremonial quality. Someone had taken considerable time and thought with this arrangement, suggesting motives far more complex than simple violence. As Inspector Slack began his methodical questioning, she filed away these observations, knowing that in mysteries, the smallest details often proved most significant. Inspector Slack's questioning proceeded with the methodical efficiency of a man accustomed to village mysteries, though Miss Marple observed that his direct approach seemed to miss certain subtleties that might prove significant. He established a systematic timeline, beginning with the household staff and working outward through the assembled guests, each interview revealing fragments of information that slowly assembled into a clearer picture of the previous evening's events. Mary, the under-housemaid who had discovered the body, proved particularly nervous under questioning, her hands twisting her apron as she recounted her morning routine. "I always cut through by the delphiniums when carrying plates to the tea tent, sir," she explained, her voice barely above a whisper. It saves time, and her ladyship never minded. But this morning, oh, sir, I never expected to find such a thing among the prize flowers. Arthur, the butler, provided the most precise account of the household's evening routine. All doors and windows secured at 11 o'clock precisely, Inspector. The side gate to the kitchen garden was bolted and chained as always. Only Colonel Bantry and myself hold duplicate keys. He paused, then added with obvious reluctance, though I did hear what sounded like a motor car on the drive sometime after midnight. When I investigated, however, the drive was quite empty. Dr. Haydock's medical assessment painted a troubling picture. Death occurred between midnight and 3 in the morning, he stated with professional precision. No obvious signs of violence or struggle. The positioning suggests she was placed there with considerable care after death had occurred. His clinical tone couldn't quite mask his bewilderment at the circumstances. Mrs. Price Ridley, when questioned, revealed her characteristic attention to social details. "The girl's dress is good quality," she declared with authority. "Not expensive, mind you, but well made. Her shoes show practically no wear, hardly walked in them at all. Someone who arrived by transport rather than on foot, I should say." Miss Marple found this observation particularly astute, noting how Mrs. Price Ridley's sharp eye for social distinctions might prove more valuable than Inspector Slack realized. She herself had been studying the white roses with growing interest, recognizing the particular shade of green wire used by florists rather than gardeners. Such professional touches suggested planning and forethought rather than impulse. The questioning revealed an intriguing detail when young Griselda Clement, still pale from the morning's shock, mentioned seeing a stranger in the village the previous day. "There was a young woman asking directions at the post office yesterday afternoon," she recalled hesitantly. "Dark-haired, about the right age. She seemed to be looking for someone, but wasn't quite certain of the address." This information caused a stir among the witnesses, though no one could provide additional details about the mysterious visitor. Miss Marple noted how several of the assembled villagers exchanged quick glances at this revelation, suggesting that someone present might know more than they were initially willing to admit. Inspector Slack's attention sharpened considerably when Constable Parker appeared with a telephone message from Much Benham Station. After a brief, terse conversation in the hallway, Slack returned, with news that transformed the investigation's direction entirely. "A young woman has been reported missing from the Queen's Arms in Much Benham," he announced grimly. "Name of Myra Johns, aged 24, employed as a barmaid for the past fortnight. Dark hair, blue dress, matches our victim's description precisely. She failed to return to her lodgings last night after finishing work at 11 o'clock. The revelation sent a ripple of recognition through the assembled company. Several villagers admitted to having visited the Queen's Arms recently, though none recalled paying particular attention to the new barmaid. Miss Marple, however, noticed how the curate had grown decidedly pale at this news, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for his teacup. As Inspector Slack prepared to depart for Much Benham to gather more information about the missing woman, Miss Marple quietly observed the reactions around her. The careful staging of the body, the professional florist's wire, and now the connection to a respectable establishment in the neighboring town all suggested a complexity that went far beyond random violence. Someone had taken considerable trouble to create this particular scene, and Miss Marple suspected the reasons would prove as carefully planned as the execution. While Inspector Slack departed for Much Benham with promises to telephone immediately upon learning more, the assembled villagers in Lady Bantry's drawing room found themselves caught between propriety and an almost irresistible curiosity about the morning's shocking discovery. The revelation that their mysterious corpse was Myra Johns, a barmaid from the Queen's Arms, had transformed mere tragedy into something far more complex and troubling. Mrs. Price Ridley, never one to let social distinctions go unmentioned, held forth from her position beside the tea table. One must ask oneself why such a person would be brought to Gossington Hall, of all places. Surely if someone wished to dispose of an inconvenient body, There are more suitable locations than Lady Bantry's prize flower bed. Her voice carried that particular tone, reserved for discussing matters that were simultaneously shocking and thrilling. Colonel Bantry, pacing before the fireplace with military precision, voiced what troubled him most. The deliberate staging of it all suggests this wasn't merely murder, but some sort of message. The careful positioning, those wired roses, someone took considerable trouble to create that particular scene. Miss Marple, her knitting needles clicking softly in the corner chair, listened to these exchanges while her sharp eyes observed the reactions around her. The curate, Reverend Forsyth, remained notably quiet, his teacup rattling slightly against its saucer whenever anyone mentioned the Queen's Arms. When young Griselda Clement casually mentioned seeing him walking toward Much Benham the previous evening around 9 o'clock, his denial came perhaps too quickly, accompanied by a flush that suggested considerable discomfort. "I occasionally take evening walks for contemplation," he stammered, avoiding Colonel Bantry's direct gaze. "The fresh air helps clear my mind after parish duties. Surely there's nothing unusual in that?" The defensive tone, however, only served to heighten Miss Marple's interest in his evening activities. Dr. Haydock, examining his brandy with professional detachment, offered a medical perspective. The absence of obvious violence suggests either poisoning or suffocation. Given the careful positioning, I suspect she was killed elsewhere and transported here. The question remains, why here, and why displayed so theatrically? Miss Marple's attention had been caught by something Mary, the under-housemaid, had mentioned earlier about the side gate chain. Arthur always threaded it twice through the lock for security, yet this morning it had been secured only once. Such a small detail, yet it suggested someone unfamiliar with the household's precise routines, or someone deliberately leaving a subtle sign of entry. More intriguing still was the embroidered cushion that had supported the victim's head. Miss Marple recognized it as one of Mrs. Hartnell's patterns sold at the church bazaar, forget-me-nots with a diamond border. She distinctly remembered the small counting error in one corner that had caused such a fuss, with Mrs. Hartnell insisting the imperfection spoiled the symmetry. The purchaser had reluctantly accepted it at a reduced price after considerable discussion. The telephone's shrill ring interrupted her musings, and Arthur appeared to announce Inspector Slack calling from Much Benham. Colonel Bantry took the call privately, returning with news that caused a stir among the assembled company. Slack reports that several witnesses saw Myra Johns leave the Queen's Arms last evening with a gentleman in a grey motor car, tall, fair-haired, with a light moustache, wearing a white rose in his buttonhole. The description matches a man calling himself Conway, staying at the Royal George with no fixed address beyond that. This revelation prompted excited murmurs, though Miss Marple noticed how Reverend Forsyth had grown decidedly pale at the mention of the white rose. Such a distinctive detail, yet one easily obtained and deliberately worn to create an impression. She found herself wondering whether the mysterious Mr. Conway was the true perpetrator or merely another carefully placed element in an increasingly elaborate deception. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across Lady Bantry's drawing room, Miss Marple quietly reflected that someone had taken extraordinary care to construct this particular mystery, complete with obvious suspects and misleading clues designed to satisfy a hasty investigation. Inspector Slack returned just after 7 o'clock, his satisfaction evident as he strode into Lady Bantry's drawing room with the air of a man whose theories had been thoroughly vindicated. The grey Humber had indeed been hired from Merritt's garage in Much Benham at 5 o'clock the previous evening, returned before dawn with precisely the mileage required for a round trip to Street. Mary Mead, the mysterious Mr. Conway, had departed the Royal George without settling his account, leaving behind only the memory of crisp banknotes and an unnaturally charming demeanor. 20 miles exactly on the motor, Slack announced with professional pride. Just enough for the journey here and back by the quieter roads. The garage attendant recalls gloved hands and a hat pulled low, classic behavior of a man with something to hide. Mrs. Price Ridley, who had appointed herself unofficial coordinator of village opinion, seized upon this development with characteristic authority. Obviously our culprit, Inspector. The theatrical touch with the white roses, the careful staging, these artistic types always overreach themselves with unnecessary flourishes. Her pronouncement carried the weight of decades spent, categorizing social transgressions, though Miss Marple noted a certain eagerness in her voice that suggested the solution felt almost disappointingly straightforward. Dr. Haydock raised a practical objection from his position by the fireplace. The timing troubles me considerably. Conway departed with the girl around 11, yet she wasn't killed until after midnight. That leaves precious little time for murder, transport to Gossington, and such elaborate arrangement. The positioning we discovered would require considerable familiarity with these grounds. Miss Marple, who had been quietly observing the assembled company throughout these discussions, found herself increasingly intrigued by the very convenience of the Conway explanation. In her extensive experience with human nature, genuine criminals rarely provided such perfectly obvious trails of evidence. The careful staging at Gossington Hall suggested someone with intimate knowledge of local customs and Lady Bantry's household routines. During a brief lull in the proceedings, she approached Lady Bantry with her characteristic gentle directness. "My dear, that embroidered cushion has been troubling me all afternoon. The forget-me-not pattern with the diamond border, wasn't that one of Mrs. Hartnell's designs from the church bazaar?" Lady Bantry brightened at this familiar topic, grateful for any distraction from the day's horrors. Indeed it was, though there was that unfortunate batch 3 years ago with the counting error in the corner pattern. Mrs. Hartnell was quite beside herself about the imperfection, but several were sold at reduced prices rather than waste the work entirely. "How practical," Miss Marple murmured. "Do you recall who purchased them?" "Let me think. Mrs. Clement bought one for her sister-in-law in Devon, and I believe young Miss Forsyth took another. The curate's sister, you know. She mentioned something about covering the floor with a bit of lace trim." This information caused Miss Marple to glance thoughtfully toward the window, where Reverend Forsyth could be seen hurrying past with unusual haste for his customary evening constitutional. His earlier discomfort during questioning had not escaped her notice, particularly his defensive reaction to any mention of Much Benham or the Queen's Arms. As the gathering began to disperse with promises of further developments on the morrow, Miss Marple reflected that someone had taken extraordinary care to construct this particular mystery. The obvious suspect had conveniently vanished, leaving behind just enough evidence to satisfy a cursory investigation, while the true significance of carefully placed local clues remained hidden beneath layers of misdirection that spoke of intimate village knowledge. The following morning brought that peculiar atmosphere which settles over villages when something dreadful has occurred and everyone is determined to behave with perfect normalcy. Street Mary Mead buzzed with an almost palpable energy, a mixture of morbid fascination and collective relief that Inspector Slack's Conway theory provided such a tidy explanation. The notion that their mysterious corpse was the work of an outsider, a transient ne'er-do-well who had merely used their peaceful community as a convenient stage for his theatrical villainy, was infinitely preferable to contemplating local involvement. Mrs. Price Ridley, naturally, held court at the post office with characteristic authority. "Just as I predicted," she declared to her captive audience. "These city types have no respect for decency. The very idea of bringing such scandal to Lady Bantry's prized delphiniums." Yet beneath the village's forced calm, Miss Marple perceived an underlying unease that suggested not everyone was entirely convinced by the convenient explanation. Miss Marple spent her morning attending to her roses, though her thoughts remained fixed on the embroidered cushion and its telltale flaw. Such a slender thread of evidence, yet in her extensive experience, the smallest details often proved most significant. Her first stop was Mrs. Hartnell's cottage, where she found that energetic lady tending her late blooms with characteristic vigor. "My dear Miss Marple, what a dreadful business," Mrs. Hartnell exclaimed, her secateurs pausing mid-snip. "Though I must say, Inspector Slack seems confident about this Conway fellow." Indeed, Miss Marple agreed mildly. I was wondering about those embroidered cushions you sold at the church bazaar, the forget-me-nots with the diamond border. I recall there was some difficulty with the pattern. Mrs. Hartnell's face brightened at this familiar topic. Oh, my dear, what a trial that was. 3 years of selling those patterns without complaint, then suddenly half a dozen came out wrong. The diamond border requires such precise counting, and I fear my instructions weren't clear about the corner turns. Most distressing, particularly when several people had already purchased them. I understand they were sold despite the flaw. At reduced prices, naturally. Mrs. Clement took one for her sister-in-law in Devon, and that sweet Miss Forsyth bought another. She mentioned wanting to practice her stitching before attempting the perfect version. Such a conscientious girl, always asking detailed questions about our local customs and notable households. This information proved most illuminating, particularly when Mrs. Hartnell mentioned Miss Forsyth's keen interest in Gossington Hall's history and Lady Bantry's garden parties. Miss Marple filed this detail away as she continued her morning errands, which included a visit to Peabody's flower shop. Mr. Peabody, thin and fastidious, brightened at the sight of his most punctual customer. "White roses yesterday?" Miss Marple inquired casually while selecting a modest pot fern. There seemed a scarcity in gardens. "Scarcity everywhere except my cold frame," Peabody replied with professional pride. "I sold a dozen to a lady from Street Mary Mead mid-afternoon. Sensible gloves?" Asked for wire separately. Most unusual gentlemen never think to ask for wire. "Quite so," Miss Marple murmured thoughtfully. "And Mr. Conway?" Peabody's expression registered professional disdain. "No, madam. That gentleman took a buttonhole of red carnation on Tuesday. Cheap taste, if you ask me." Armed with this revelation, Miss Marple made her way to the vicarage under the pretense of inquiring about a recipe for plum jam. Reverend Forsyth greeted her with obvious strain, his eyes holding that haunted quality she had observed the previous day. He seemed to flinch slightly at any mention of recent events. "A dreadful business, Miss Marple. Truly dreadful." He sighed, ushering her toward the kitchen where his sister Amelia presided over a pot of simmering jam. Miss Forsyth, a woman of quiet demeanor and meticulous habits, welcomed her with perhaps excessive warmth, her hands constantly engaged in domestic tasks, as if seeking refuge in familiar routines. "Miss Marple, how kind of you to call," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Such a shock yesterday. We hardly slept a wink." Miss Marple engaged her in pleasant conversation about the jam before subtly steering toward her real interest. "I was just admiring the lovely cushions in your parlor, Miss Forsyth. They remind me of those delightful ones Mrs. Hartnell used to sell at the church bazaar. Such intricate patterns, though I recall a slight imperfection in some of them." Amelia's hands, which had been stirring with steady rhythm, paused almost imperceptibly. A faint flush touched her pale cheeks. "Oh yes, Mrs. Hartnell was quite upset about it. But I always say, a little character never hurt anyone. I bought one myself, for a song, and added lace trim to disguise the tiny error." Miss Marple's keen eyes had already located the cushion on the window seat, its small flaw artfully concealed by delicate lace bordering. On the side table nearby lay a coil of green wire and small pliers, beside a vase where 3 white roses stood with the unnatural rigidity that spoke of professional florist techniques rather than garden cutting. "We have the chancel arrangements this week," Miss Forsyth explained quickly, following Miss Marple's glance. The stalks flopped dreadfully, if not properly supported. As they moved to the parlor for tea, Miss Marple noticed a pinhead fleck of pale blue silk on the hearth rug, one strand only, but it sparked recognition of Mrs. Hartnell's particular thread, a shade called Forget-Me-Not No. 12. Reverend Forsyth remained notably quiet throughout the visit, his posture stiff and his gaze fixed downward whenever the conversation touched on recent events. Their discussion was interrupted by young Griselda Clement, whose usual cheerful demeanor had been replaced by obvious distress. "Miss Marple, I'm so terribly worried about something. Last evening, after all the questioning, I saw Miss Forsyth burning papers in the garden, quite a large pile tied with blue ribbon. She was most thorough about ensuring they burned completely, stirring the ashes until nothing remained." As Miss Marple took her leave, she reflected that someone had indeed taken extraordinary care to construct this particular mystery. The convenient Mr. Conway had provided the perfect misdirection, while the true significance of local clues, the flawed cushion, the professional florist wire, the carefully burned correspondence, remained hidden beneath layers of deception that spoke of intimate village knowledge and considerable planning. The grey Humber might have carried a mysterious stranger, but the real architect of this theatrical crime was someone who understood street, Mary Mead's rhythms with the precision that comes only from living among its secrets. The revelation that shattered street. Mary Mead's comfortable assumptions arrived with Inspector Slack's return that evening, his expression bearing none of the satisfaction that had marked his earlier pronouncements. The mysterious Mr. Conway had indeed been located, but not as the triumphant conclusion to their investigation that everyone had anticipated. Instead, the man calling himself Conway proved to be Charles Whitmore, a perfectly respectable insurance clerk from Bloomsbury with an unshakable alibi for the night in question. The entire Conway identity was an elaborate fabrication, Slack announced grimly to the hastily reassembled company at Gossington Hall. Someone went to considerable trouble to create this false trail, complete with forged credentials for hiring the motor car and carefully coached witnesses at the Queen's Arms. "We've been deliberately misled from the beginning." The effect of this revelation rippled through the drawing room like a stone thrown into still water. Mrs. Price Ridley, so recently confident in her outsider theory, sat in uncharacteristic silence, her usual authority deflated by the collapse of her convenient explanation. Colonel Bantry resumed his agitated pacing, while Lady Bantry twisted her handkerchief with obvious distress at the implication that their peaceful village harbored such calculated deception. Miss Marple, observing from her corner chair, noted how this news affected different members of their company. Dr. Haydock nodded with professional satisfaction, as if his earlier doubts about the timeline had been vindicated. Young Griselda Clement appeared genuinely shocked, while her husband's expression suggested he had harbored private doubts about the Conway explanation from the beginning. Inspector Slack continued with obvious reluctance. "There's more disturbing news about the victim herself. According to the landlord at the Queen's Arms, Miss Johns wasn't merely seeking employment as a barmaid. She had been making detailed inquiries about residents of Street Mary Mead, particularly those connected to the church, asking specific questions about events from 3 or 4 years past. This information transformed their understanding of Myra Johns entirely. Rather than an innocent victim of chance encounter, she emerged as someone conducting a deliberate investigation into village affairs, seeking information about past scandals and private correspondence. Miss Marple reflected that such activities might well have uncovered secrets worth killing to protect. "What sort of inquiries?" Lady Bantry asked, though her tone suggested she dreaded the answer. Family histories, personal relationships, matters that might have been considered confidential. She claimed to be researching genealogy, but her questions were remarkably specific about clerical appointments and ecclesiastical matters from several years ago. The silence that followed this revelation was broken by Reverend Forsyth, rising abruptly from his chair, his face pale and strained. "I'm afraid I must return to the vicarage immediately," he stammered, avoiding all eyes. "My sister will be concerned about my prolonged absence." His departure was so precipitous that he nearly collided with Arthur in the doorway, leaving behind an atmosphere thick with unspoken suspicions. Miss Marple watched his retreat with particular interest, mentally cataloguing the accumulating evidence. The burned correspondence tied with blue ribbon, the professional florist supplies at the vicarage, the flawed embroidered cushion. And now the revelation that their victim had been investigating church-related scandals from precisely the period when such correspondence might have been most significant. The pattern emerging suggested someone with intimate knowledge of both village customs and ecclesiastical procedures. Someone who understood exactly how to stage a scene that would initially point away from local involvement. As the gathering dispersed with promises of renewed investigation in the morning, Miss Marple remained in her chair, her knitting needles clicking softly in the lamplight. The elaborate Conway deception spoke of considerable planning and resources, but more significantly, it revealed a mind that understood how investigations proceeded, how evidence would be interpreted, and how suspicion could be skillfully misdirected. Such knowledge suggested not merely local involvement, but someone with particular insight into both human nature and official procedures, qualities that might be found in someone whose profession required managing both parish secrets and public trust. The morning brought news that sent ripples of fresh unease through Street Mary Mead's carefully maintained composure. Mr. Orchard, the verger, appeared at the vicarage just after 8 o'clock with the disturbing discovery that the vestry safe stood open, its contents methodically ransacked. Not forced opened with obvious familiarity with the mechanism, but several crucial items had vanished entirely, including a section of the marriage register and a bundle of correspondence that had rested undisturbed for years. Inspector Slack arrived with characteristic efficiency, though his examination of the safe revealed the troubling absence of any signs of forced entry. "Keys," he stated grimly, studying the undamaged lock. "Who holds them besides the vicar?" "Reverend Forsyth, naturally," Mr. Orchard replied, his voice trembling slightly. "And Colonel Bantry as churchwarden keeps a set in his study cabinet for emergencies. No one else has authorized access." Colonel Bantry, summoned from his morning ride, produced his keys immediately. Slack's inspection confirmed they remained untouched in their proper case. Only Reverend Forsyth's set remained unaccounted for, the curate having departed for Much Benham before dawn on what his sister described as urgent parish business, though she seemed uncertain about the specific nature of his errand. Miss Marple, arriving ostensibly to discuss flower arrangements for Sunday service, observed the scene with her characteristic quiet attention. A fragment of blue ribbon clung to the safe's edge, pressed flat where the door had closed upon it. On the vestry table lay a single white rose petal, unnaturally perfect and bearing the telltale rigidity of professional cultivation rather than garden growth. Most significantly, the parish register showed clear evidence of pages carefully removed, not torn in haste, but cut with precision to eliminate specific entries from 3 summers past. The missing section covers late June through mid-July, Inspector Slack announced to the assembled witnesses. Precisely the period when certain irregularities in parish records might have required official documentation. Mrs. Clement, who had arrived with obvious reluctance, finally produced a bundle of letters that cast new light on recent events. "These arrived for Leonard over the past month," she explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "Signed by someone calling herself M. Johns, asking detailed questions about Reverend Forsyth's previous appointment at Little Wickham. Leonard was quite disturbed by the implications." The correspondence proved most illuminating, revealing that someone had been conducting an elaborate investigation using the murdered woman's name weeks before she arrived in Much Benham. The questions focused specifically on financial discrepancies during Forsyth's final year at his previous parish, matters that would require considerable research to uncover and intimate knowledge of ecclesiastical procedures to understand fully. Miss Marple studied these developments with growing certainty that the truth lay not in external threats, but in carefully buried village secrets. Her subsequent visit to the vicarage, under the pretense of discussing harvest decorations, confirmed her suspicions. Miss Forsyth received her with forced cheerfulness that barely concealed obvious strain, while the parlor showed clear signs of hasty tidying. The coil of green wire and small pliers had vanished from their previous prominent position, though 3 white roses still stood in their vase with unnatural rigidity. "Such a trying time for everyone," Miss Marple observed gently, noting how Miss Forsyth's hands trembled as she arranged chrysanthemums. It makes one realize how past events can resurface unexpectedly, particularly when someone is determined to uncover them. The effect was immediate and telling. Miss Forsyth's careful composure wavered, her face flushing as she turned abruptly to adjust an already perfect curtain. "Some things are better left buried," she replied, her voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "Not everything from the past deserves to be dragged into the light." As Miss Marple took her leave, she reflected that the elaborate Conway deception had served its purpose perfectly, providing crucial time for the destruction of evidence while misdirecting official attention. But the psychological pressure of maintaining such an intricate fiction was proving too much for nerves already strained by guilt and the constant fear of discovery. The afternoon brought Reverend Forsyth's return from Much Benham, his appearance so altered that even the most charitable observer might have questioned his claimed parish business. Inspector Slack, abandoning the comfortable certainty of the Conway explanation, had spent the morning methodically retracing the curate's movements and discovered several troubling inconsistencies. Forsyth had indeed purchased a London ticket but never boarded the train, spending considerable time instead at Merritt's garage, discussing motorcar hire records with the detailed knowledge of someone already familiar with the arrangements, rather than someone seeking information. Miss Marple, observing Forsyth's return from her garden gate, catalogued several telling details that spoke of a man under extraordinary strain. Fresh ink stains marked his right cuff. The faint odor of coal smoke clung to his clothing despite the mild weather, and most significantly, a small burn mark on his left hand suggested recent contact with flame or heated metal. Such evidence painted a picture of someone who had spent considerable time destroying documents, possibly including items that required more thorough elimination than simple paper burning. The day's most damaging revelation arrived with a telegram from the bishop's office, read aloud by Inspector Slack to the assembled company at Gossington Hall. Reverend Forsyth had departed his previous appointment at Little Wickham under circumstances involving certain financial irregularities, necessitating his transfer to the smaller, more closely supervised parish of Street, Mary Mead. The diplomatic language could not disguise the serious nature of whatever had occurred. And Mrs. Price Ridley voiced what others were thinking when she observed that a clergyman's reputation, once tarnished, rarely recovered completely. Armed with this information and her growing certainty about the truth, Miss Marple decided the time had come for more direct action. That evening, she invited the Forsyths, along with Lady Bantry and Dr. Haydock, for tea under the pretense of discussing harvest decorations. When her guests were settled with their customary care, she spoke of trifles until nerves had settled, then delivered her carefully calculated revelation with characteristic gentleness. "Such a comfort that the county keeps security copies of parish registers these days," she observed placidly, noting how every eye in the room fixed upon her with sudden intensity. "Inspector Slack tells me the archivist is sending a clerk tomorrow morning with photographic proofs of all missing pages, so reassuring that proper order will be restored." The effect moved through the room like a cold draught through a closed house. Dr. Haydock set down his cup with a telling click, while Reverend Forsyth's fingers tightened convulsively before relaxing as if by supreme effort. Most significantly, Amelia Forsyth's carefully maintained composure wavered visibly, her hands going white at the knuckles as she struggled to maintain her pleasant expression. "I am so relieved that proper order will be restored," she managed, though her voice strained for evenness that no longer came naturally. "Order," Miss Marple agreed mildly, "is so very restful." After the others departed, Miss Marple reflected that psychological pressure, properly applied, revealed truth more effectively than any amount of physical evidence. The elaborate Conway deception had provided crucial time for destroying incriminating documents, but the constant fear of discovery was proving too much for nerves already strained by guilt and desperation. Tomorrow would bring either confession or another desperate attempt to silence the truth permanently. The morning following Miss Marple's carefully orchestrated revelation brought the inevitable collapse of Amelia Forsyth's elaborate deception. Miss Marple had positioned herself in her garden early, knowing that desperate people often made their most telling mistakes when psychological pressure reached its breaking point. Her vigil was rewarded when she observed unusual activity at the vicarage, curtains drawn, despite the pleasant morning, and the unmistakable signs of someone preparing for hasty departure. Her telephone call to Inspector Slack was characteristically precise. "I'm afraid I took a small liberty yesterday evening, Inspector. There are no missing county archives, and no clerk arriving today. The announcement was merely a test of someone's nerves. However, I believe you should visit the vicarage immediately. Miss Forsyth appears to be in considerable distress." When Inspector Slack arrived with Constable Parker, they found Amelia Forsyth in her parlor, surrounded by the remnants of a sleepless night spent destroying the last traces of evidence. The coil of green wire had been cut into tiny pieces, the small pliers wrapped in brown paper for disposal. And most tellingly, the embroidered cushion with its concealing lace trim lay torn apart, its flawed stitching exposed like an accusation. Miss Marple's gentle presence seemed to provide the final catalyst for confession. "My dear," she said quietly, settling into the familiar chair, "there really is no point in further deception. The psychological burden has become too great, hasn't it?" The words broke through Amelia's remaining composure like water through a failing dam. Years of carefully maintained secrecy, weeks of elaborate planning, and days of mounting terror collapsed into desperate honesty. "I never meant for it to happen," she whispered, her voice barely audible, but she was going to destroy everything: Leonard's reputation, his calling, our entire life. The confession that followed revealed a tragedy born of misguided loyalty and protective desperation. Myra Johns had indeed been conducting a deliberate investigation, but not as a casual blackmailer seeking easy money. She possessed detailed knowledge of financial irregularities during Reverend Forsyth's tenure at Little Wickham, irregularities that Amelia herself had created while attempting to cover her brother's gambling debts by altering parish accounts. "She had copies of correspondence I thought had been destroyed years ago," Amelia continued, her hands twisting in her lap, "letters between Leonard and his creditors, evidence of the altered books, even photographic copies of register entries I had modified. She demanded £200 to keep silent, threatening to expose everything to the bishop if we refused." The elaborate Conway deception had been Amelia's desperate masterstroke, a fictional identity created to provide misdirection while she eliminated the threat to her brother's carefully rebuilt reputation. Using her intimate knowledge of village routines and her brother's clerical authority, she had orchestrated the entire charade, from hiring the motorcar under false credentials to coaching witnesses at the Queen's Arms to remember a mysterious gentleman with a white rose buttonhole. The theatrical staging at Gossington Hall was calculated to suggest an outsider's work, she admitted, tears streaming down her pale cheeks. The professional florist wire, the careful positioning among the prized delphiniums, all designed to point suspicion away from anyone with local knowledge. Even the embroidered cushion was chosen deliberately, knowing its flaw would eventually be traced to village sources, but only after the Conway trail had been thoroughly investigated. Inspector Slack, maintaining professional composure despite his obvious distress at the revelation, pressed for details about the actual murder. Amelia's account revealed a meeting arranged under the pretense of negotiating payment terms, conducted in the privacy of the vicarage garden after Leonard had retired for the evening, unaware of his sister's desperate plans. "I used chloroform from Leonard's medical supplies," she whispered, her voice growing fainter with each admission. She suspected nothing until it was too late. The positioning at Gossington was done during the early morning hours, using the side gate key I had borrowed from Arthur's pantry weeks earlier while helping with church arrangements. Miss Marple observed the proceedings with characteristic sadness, recognizing how protective love had transformed into destructive obsession. The most tragic element was Reverend Forsyth's complete ignorance of his sister's actions. His obvious distress and defensive behavior had stemmed from guilt about his past mistakes and fear of exposure, never suspecting that his devoted sister had committed murder to protect him. As Inspector Slack completed the formalities, Miss Marple reflected that the elaborate deception had demonstrated considerable intelligence and planning, but ultimately had been undone by the psychological impossibility of maintaining such an intricate fiction while living daily among the people she had deceived. The careful staging that should have provided perfect misdirection had instead created a web of evidence that pointed inexorably towards someone with intimate village knowledge and access to specific local resources. The case concluded with Amelia Forsyth's quiet arrest, her brother's complete breakdown upon learning the truth, and the village's gradual return to its customary rhythms, though with an underlying awareness that even the most peaceful communities could harbor secrets capable of transforming protective devotion into deadly deception. The morning following Amelia Forsyth's arrest brought that peculiar quiet which settles over villages when shocking truths have finally been spoken aloud. Street. Mary Mead moved with subdued care, as if ordinary sounds might somehow disturb the delicate process of understanding how their peaceful community had harbored such calculated deception. Lady Bantry, seeking some form of closure for herself and others, invited the principal witnesses to Miss Marple's cottage that afternoon, hoping that clarity might prove as healing as time. Inspector Slack arrived with his notebook closed for once, while Dr. Haydock brought fresh scones wrapped in a tea towel. Colonel Bantry hovered with obvious contrition, and young Griselda Clement slipped quietly into the corner chair, her usual brightness tempered by recent events. Miss Marple poured tea with her customary precision and began, not with accusations, but with the small details that had guided her understanding. "One must always observe the hands," she said mildly, settling her knitting in her lap. Mary mentioned that the side gate chain had been looped once rather than twice, which contradicted Arthur's invariable habit. It suggested someone who had copied what they observed but didn't quite understand the ritual behind it. She paused to adjust her spectacles before continuing. Then there were the wired roses. Gardeners use patience and natural stems, but florists employ wire for professional arrangements. Mr. Peabody confirmed selling white roses and wire to a careful lady the day before our tragedy. Though no gentleman matching Conway's description had purchased anything from his establishment, Inspector Slack shifted uncomfortably, remembering his eager pursuit of the fictional Conway, but Miss Marple's gentle tone held no reproach. "The embroidered cushion proved most illuminating," she continued. "Mrs. Hartnell's forget-me-not pattern with that distinctive flaw in the corner." I recalled the considerable discussion when several imperfect pieces were sold at reduced prices. The trail led quite naturally from Lady Bantry's delphiniums to the vicarage window seat. Colonel Bantry cleared his throat, but the elaborate Conway deception surely that required considerable resources and planning. "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed. "Someone with intimate knowledge of how investigations proceed, how evidence would be interpreted, and how suspicion could be skillfully misdirected. The forged credentials, the coached witnesses at the Queen's Arms, even the timing of the motor car hire all demonstrated remarkable foresight and understanding of official procedures." Dr. Haydock set down his teacup with visible distress. Poor Forsyth knew nothing of his sister's actions. His breakdown upon learning the truth was genuine. The guilt of a man discovering that his past mistakes had driven someone he loved to commit murder for his protection. "Misguided devotion," Miss Marple observed, sadly. Amelia's love for her brother was genuine, but it had transformed over years of covering his financial irregularities into something possessive and ultimately destructive. The gambling debts at Little Wickham, the altered parish records she had protected him so long that exposure seemed worse than murder itself. Griselda spoke quietly from her corner. The burned correspondence, tied with blue ribbon, she was destroying the evidence that connected her to the original forgeries, wasn't she? "Precisely, my dear. Years of carefully maintained secrets, weeks of elaborate planning, and the constant psychological pressure of maintaining such an intricate deception while living daily among the people she had deceived. The human mind, however clever, struggles under such sustained strain. As the small gathering prepared to depart, Miss Marple reflected that the case had demonstrated once again how the most dangerous criminals were often those who understood their communities most intimately. Amelia's knowledge of village customs, household routines, and individual personalities had enabled her to construct a deception that might have succeeded indefinitely, had the psychological burden not ultimately proved unbearable. The afternoon shadows lengthened across her cottage garden as Miss Marple resumed her knitting, contemplating how protective love, when twisted by fear and pride, could transform the most devoted hearts into instruments of calculated destruction. The weeks following that afternoon gathering brought the inevitable process of healing that marks all village communities after profound disruption. Street Mary Mead moved through its daily routines with careful deliberation, as if ordinary activities might somehow restore the equilibrium that Amelia Forsyth's revelation had so thoroughly shattered. The autumn light fell golden across familiar gardens, but conversations carried an undertone of thoughtful reflection that had not existed before the corpse appeared among Lady Bantry's prize delphiniums. Inspector Slack's final report arrived with characteristic efficiency, providing the official closure that legal proceedings required while filling in details that the village's collective memory would preserve for generations. Amelia's confession had revealed the full scope of her elaborate deception, from the initial correspondence with Myra Johns 6 weeks before the murder to the meticulous planning that had created the fictional Conway identity. The psychological portrait that emerged spoke of protective devotion, gradually transformed into something far more dangerous. Years of covering financial irregularities, having established patterns of deception that made murder seem merely the logical extension of behaviors already practiced. Reverend Forsyth departed Street Mary Mead quietly, his resignation accepted by the bishop with the diplomatic language that ecclesiastical authorities employ for such delicate matters. His final sermon, delivered to a congregation that watched with mixture of sympathy and relief, focused on forgiveness and redemption, though his voice trembled when he blessed the children. The vicarage stood empty afterward, its windows reflecting autumn light with the particular melancholy of abandoned homes, while a young curate from the cathedral took temporary charge of parish duties. Lady Bantry resumed her social obligations with characteristic grace, though those who knew her well observed how she avoided the delphinium border during her morning walks. The prize flowers bloomed with renewed vigor, as if determined to reclaim their corner of the garden from tragedy's shadow, but the careful staging of Myra Johns's body had left an indelible impression on that peaceful landscape. Arthur maintained his household routines with military precision, though he now secured the side gate chain with particular attention to its proper double loop. Mrs. Price Ridley, chastened by her eager acceptance of the Conway deception, had grown notably more circumspect in her social pronouncements, while Dr. Haydock reflected privately on the disturbing efficiency with which respectability could mask calculated violence. Young Griselda Clement found herself studying faces more carefully, wondering what secrets might lie beneath familiar expressions, while her husband observed these changes with the protective concern of someone who had witnessed innocence's permanent alteration. Miss Marple, her knitting needles clicking their familiar rhythm in the afternoon sunlight, contemplated the broader implications of what they had witnessed. The case had demonstrated once again how the most dangerous criminals were often those who understood their communities most intimately, using knowledge of local customs and individual personalities to construct deceptions that might have succeeded indefinitely. Amelia's years of managing parish correspondence and social arrangements had provided exactly the skills necessary for creating the elaborate Conway fiction, while her intimate understanding of village routines had enabled her to move through Street Mary Mead's familiar landscape like a ghost, The psychological burden of maintaining such intricate deception while living daily among the people she had deceived had ultimately proved unbearable, confirming Miss Marple's long-held belief that human nature, however clever, struggles under sustained duplicity. The careful staging at Gossington Hall, the professional florist's supplies, the burned correspondence tied with blue ribbon, all had spoken of someone with particular insight into both ecclesiastical procedures and investigative methods, qualities that protective devotion had transformed into instruments of calculated destruction. As the days shortened and the village settled into winter's approaching rhythms, Miss Marple reflected that Street Mary Mead would eventually absorb this tragedy as it had others, the shock gradually fading into memory while new scandals and fresh gossip claimed attention. Yet for those who had witnessed it, the case would remain a permanent reminder that even the most peaceful communities could harbor secrets capable of transforming protective love into deadly deception, and that the greatest mysteries often lay not in external threats, but in the human heart's capacity for both devotion and destruction. The afternoon shadows lengthened across her cottage garden as Miss Marple resumed her knitting, content that truth, however painful, had ultimately prevailed over even the most carefully constructed lies. The end,